Hello and welcome to this edition of EMS Now Up Close. I'm Eric with EMS Now. He is Dale Ford. He's the Chief Analyst with the ECIA, the Electronic Component Industry Association. Dale, I wanted to get a chance to talk to you because I know just last month, or it is this month, still in April, just a little while ago, ECI released its top 50 America's Authorized Distributors Report about the electronic component distribution industry. So I wanted to kind of talk about that with you, but let's begin with kind of if you can give a history of the report and what it includes, because I know this year is kind of unique in that it's also the first year you're not doing this in conjunction with electronic sourcing. It's been released through trusted parts. So maybe tell us a little about the history of the report and what's included.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Uh, in my role at ECIA, I took on work on doing a top 50, both America's and worldwide authorized distributors report. We teamed up with electronic sourcing on this originally, and I did the research first, publishing the results for 2020.
Okay.
And so prior to this year, I've done this for 5 years. This is the sixth year of publishing results for the top 50. One of the major and important changes we made when we engaged with electronic sourcing, they've been doing some research before in this area, but a major change we made is that we insisted that we not include brokers, independent distributors, that this report, our top 50, would only include authorized distributors consistent with our mission to support the authorized channel.
Yeah.
This year, we're publishing this report separately from electronic sourcing. Just working with our members, there was just a conflict of interest, I guess you could say, in terms of their continued significant support of brokers and independent distributors that just was not consistent with the mission, our mission in supporting the authorized distributors. So
Yeah.
the decision was made that this year we would go separately and publish this research. And so, as you mentioned, we're publishing the results through trusted parts and teaming up with other partners like EMSNOW in providing visibility on this research. As I understand, electronic sourcing will continue to try and do their own research in this area, but it should be clear that these are now two different areas of research between us and electronic sourcing. So that's an
Okay.
important distinction we want to make.
Good, very good. And you mentioned in there too that so this one is the top 50 Americas, but you'll also be working on releasing a global one.
Yeah, I've been doing the global research for the same period of time. And so the global research is an important component. Again, it's only for authorized distributors,
Hmm.
but in that global research, we see a much larger participation by Asian distributors.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand, I guess you could say, our place in the larger world.
Right. Now, and let's get into that because I think that I was a chance to review the report, and by the way, it is available to people to access both through Trusted Parts, or you can go to EMS Now and see it. We have a link to it posted there as well, so we encourage people to please do so. But so let's start big picture. What do you think are the highlights from 2025 compared to 2024?
Well, it's interesting. There are a number of key areas that I think come out of this report. One that I thought was quite significant is that for the first time in the history of doing this survey, military aerospace became the largest end market segment
Yeah.
for authorized distribution. Typically, if we go back into history, industrial electronics has been the strong number one segment in the marketplace. But as we went through 2025, what we found is that at the same time, we had a big surge in the market for military aerospace, which in a way isn't too surprising given what's happening in the world and the huge boost in military budgets and spending and global conflicts, etc. We saw a major increase there. At the same time, industrial saw not a major, but a 6% roughly decline in revenues in the industrial segment. So at the same time, we had nearly 35% growth in military aerospace to become the largest segment, not by a long ways, but still the largest segment. We saw a slight decline in the industrial and automotive space. So those two together wound up giving us a new, I should say, champion in terms of the largest end markets. Now, we do have a fairly diverse marketplace in the Americas, but many of the markets did see a decline in the end markets, energy and power, medical, telecom equipment, you know, building and home, security, et cetera. So many of the segments that have been major segments actually saw a slight decline. And the two areas the two important areas, I guess you could say, for driving growth, the most important, again, mil-aero, and then also automotive had a slight improvement this year. But, if you look at the end markets were somewhat problematic in terms of where many of them, the growth that many of them experienced. And really, we owe our growth last year to the mil-aerospace segment. So
Okay.
I guess you could say consistent with that, if we look at the component types and the revenue growth by component type, semiconductors continue to be, as they have been for some time now, the largest segment for electronics components. Last year they were 40, in 2025, I should say, they're 44% of the market. And so that's important to note that continues. It's down a little bit from 45.5% share of the Americas market before, but the most significant growth that last year that was achieved came from the electromechanical and the interconnect segments. Those two segments driving double-digit growth, 13.4% for electromechanical, 10.1% for interconnect. So those were the most significant markets for growth. And again, I guess not surprising given the important role of mil-aero and automotive in the market last year. Semiconductors did grow, but by only 3.7% last year.
Okay. So if you look at the big picture, and I'm looking at one of the graphs here, so we achieved, or the industry achieved, what, 30.9 billion in sales or revenue here in 2025. But if I look at the growth over the last, since you've been doing this, it's like it was an up year, then a couple down years, a couple up years, a couple down years. Now we're on an up year again. So it's an interesting kind of roller coaster ride this industry goes through.
Yeah, it's been an interesting pattern that the industry has gone through for many years now. In the actual report, I discussed this in the actual report, and for many years we had this pattern where we've had 2 years of growth followed by 2 years of decline, 2 years of growth, 2 years of decline. Now, the last 2 years of growth that we had before the last 2 years of decline, those were just, the market skyrocketed. They were just off the charts in terms of their growth. And so we had some real boom times if you go back to 2021, 22. So those were years of incredible growth that took place. Then we took a hit. We had 2 years, 23 and 24, with decline. Fortunately, we weren't hit as hard, but still 2 years of declining revenues. Now we've had it yet. We've returned back at least the first year of growth, and the hope will be that we can continue this on in 2026 and have 2 years of growth back to back. So it has been an interesting pattern that the industry has gone through.
Yep. And it's interesting because obviously you mentioned 21, 22, it's post-COVID and the whole industry, everything went crazy there. And then, of course, the 2 years of decline, some people said, we focus a lot on EMS, and the EMS industry saw the similar pattern, I think. And that was probably because of a lot of overbuying in 2022, right? Where a lot of warehouses became very full again, and the sales just weren't there the following year.
Yeah, that's the ongoing challenge that our industry faces, is that when times are tight, everybody is scrambling to get a supply and they build up inventories, and then those inventories wind up giving a significant overhang. The market doesn't necessarily even have to decline in the next year, but just there's so much inventory that's built up that has to be worked off
Yeah.
that can have an impact on shipments of products. So, that is not an easy problem to solve for our
Yeah.
industry. In fact, again, even in the midst of the current growth that we have going on, there are segments in the marketplace, and I can get into this in a little bit, but we have significant demand being placed on the market, particularly due to artificial intelligence and all these data centers that are going into place.
Yeah.
And what they're trying to do in the supply chain is try and provide as much visibility as possible on, I hesitate to use this word because it's used in another context, the actual demand, you
Yeah.
know, and try to resist the double ordering and, shall we say, some of the irrational activity that can take place in the marketplace. So the distributors and the manufacturers are really working with their customers to try and meet the actual demand and
Hmm.
not wind up in a difficult situation yet again where we build up excess inventory, because we have a real risk in this current environment of building up a significant imbalance in the marketplace. We have, I guess you could say, a number of golden screws, as they call it, where
Yep.
for lack of supply of certain critical components of high price, low price, that you're not able to complete the full system, and you wind up with excess inventories in other areas. And so we have the challenge of trying to avoid the double ordering and also trying to keep as much balance as possible in the inventories as well. So
Yeah.
we're facing that challenge in the current environment.
Yeah. Now, what we're hearing a lot about is obviously what's happening in the memory market. That's getting a lot of headlines, getting a lot of discussion. What do you think will happen to the memory market here? I mean, obviously, data centers are consuming a lot of memory.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because there are some, very strong demand signals, but there's also some, I should say, areas to be cautious in. So what we have right now is the the key component is what's called high bandwidth memory, HBM. And this high bandwidth memory, we're stacking memory chips on top of a logic board, on top of a substrate, uh, which gives important performance improvements, both in terms of speed and in terms of reduced heat. And so this HBM memory has become really critical in opening up what had been a memory bottleneck. So we have the processors, and there's various architectures for processors out there. And those, of course, play an important role, but equally as important now is the memory. And so the HBM memory, because of the stacked die format and what it does, you wind up, it roughly translates into consuming about 3 times as much memory as you would for a standard DRAM part.
Okay.
And so you have a fungible pool of silicon available. And so if you're using 3 times as much for HBM memory, that just applies a squeeze on every other type of memory.
Yeah.
And so what that's done is it's jacked up pricing that's just gone through the roof. So we look at the growth in the semiconductor markets, for example, just as a quick aside, and we go, yay, we've got great growth in the semiconductor market. Well, yes, but the primary driver of that growth last year and continuing into this year is memory. And in memory, the primary driver of that growth is the fact that prices have gone up more than 10x, which is
Mhm.
just astounding when you look at pricing trends. And so I'd always said that this was an ASP driven semiconductor cycle. Well, that's especially true in the memory space. It's just insane. In fact, if you look at the pricing in memory now, other categories thankfully have kicked in and achieved growth as we've gone through the course of last year and into this year. But The other segments, we're talking single-digit growth, some cases even low single-digit growth. And so what's really driving it off the charts is memory, and then followed by logic application-specific chips for data centers. And so the memory has really become very significant. And, for a while we've been trying to predict, when will the semiconductor market reach $1 trillion in revenue?
Mm-hmm.
And if we looked at the historical patterns and where we were going, would have predicted, okay, by 2030, we should hit $1 trillion in revenue. With what's happened in memory, by the end of this year, we'll be at $1 trillion run rate.
Oh,
and in fact, last month, if we look at the WSTS statistics, memory accounted for half of semiconductor revenues. If we look at the results from March. No, I guess that's February results.
Okay.
So, normally it would account for, between 20 and 30% of semiconductor revenues, maybe on average, roughly 25%. It accounted for half of the semiconductor revenues in the last WSTS statistics.
Let me peel this onion back a little bit too, because one of the things that I wanted to ask you about that I think is related to this is I notice in there you have a chart that shows sales by different groups. So you have the OEMs being the primary one at over 59%, EMS around 27, and others at 13, about 13.4.
Yeah.
Who exactly are the others? Are these what they call the hyperscalers, like the Google and the Amazon, or do you consider those in the OEM side?
That's a good question. Others are kind of it's a mixed bag, I guess you could say. It's hard to define just one type of company, but you do have this situation where you have companies that are, shall we say, they're not your traditional OEMs. They are your companies that are better known for their software or their services. But now, as we go into the artificial intelligence world, these companies now have an opportunity to perhaps take control of their own destiny a little bit more.
Yeah.
And we see, and it's interesting, a little bit more of a development of vertical integration that we had moved away from for many years now. We've had more of a horizontal integration structure to the industry. And I guess the best example you could give of this and is what Elon Musk is doing. Elon Musk is going for complete vertical integration. And what he's doing, in fact, now he's teamed up with Intel to put in place his tariff fab, I think he's calling it. So he's building this massive fab that does everything from back end to front end processing to team up with his other businesses. And so you see more of this potential development of vertical integration in the industry. And so in some of those vertical integration plays, you'll see some going into those opportunities for that type of manufacturing. Still not a large part. You can't account for all the data centers that are going into place with the other category, but it does begin to play a little bit of a role. But it's always played a little bit of a role.
Yeah, you make the point that I've been hearing a lot lately, which is that hardware is becoming sexy again, right? It's just, there's that shift. Everybody went to software. Now that it's coming back to the hardware because how important that really is. So,
well, the other interesting thing though is that there's, we talked about the great opportunities with artificial intelligence and all the advances there and the exciting future that it brings to play. But there's also concerns, which is that, we're producing these chips and delivering them out there, but there's concern about the back, I should say, where you wind up deploying these data centers and the ability to power these data centers. And one of the cautions, and I hate to bring him up too much, I do reference him a bit. It's hard not to when he plays as big a role as he does, but Elon Musk. And he's called out, said, hey, we may have a problem where we start stacking up chips out there. Again, the inventory problem that we're worried about, because we simply don't have enough electricity to power up all of these data centers. And so in his view, the most valuable thing in the world is going to become electricity, power. That's going to become the most valuable thing a commodity, whatever you want to call it, out there. And so that becomes very significant when you look at just how much power is required. And in fact, it's become kind of a tug of war between utilities and manufacturers and governments in terms of just balancing out the opportunities for the data centers, but also not swamping and overwhelming the other needs that we have for electricity that are ongoing. And so,
Yeah.
that becomes a major issue going forward.
Yeah, in a sense, going back to the memory thing too, which obviously you're talking about there, but it's a supply demand thing. So people say, well, why don't the memory manufacturers just make more? Well, this is a build out of what, 3 to 5 years. So how much do they really want to invest to do that when potentially in 3 to 5 years, the build out is done and we plateau?
Yeah, and we really kind of have a triumvirate in the memory space. You have Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron. And those three companies dominate the memory space. Now you have Chinese manufacturers coming in, playing a bit more of a role than they have in the past, but really those three dominate the memory space. And most Western companies are going to be hesitant to tie up with the Chinese supplier anyway. But if you look, they are engaging in significant CapEx spending for additional capacity in memory production. But at the same time, if you look at their earnings reports, their earnings calls, they're being somewhat cautious because memory manufacturers are very familiar with the painful cycle that they go through, where they can have some boom years and then they put in so much capacity that then they really struggle with being unable to fill that capacity after some point. So while there is strong demand right now, the memory manufacturers are being somewhat cautious in how quickly they're investing in adding more capacity. And so that's another element that's kind of creating stress in the supply chain.
Yeah.